February 8, 1944, near Littoria, Italy. A Canadian sergeant named Tommy Prince has been lying in an observation post above German lines for nearly 24 hours, watching enemy positions through a telescope and calling artillery strikes down on them through a telephone wire that runs 1,500 yards back to his own lines. This is reconnaissance work, the kind of job that asks a man to become furniture, to stay so still and so quiet for so long that the ground around him simply forgets he is there, while he tells other men, over a wire, exactly where to aim the guns that are killing the soldiers watching the same ground from the other side. He has not eaten, he has not slept, and somewhere in the last hour, a German shell has landed close enough to sever the wire, cutting him off completely, in full view of the German gun crews he has spent the entire day helping to destroy. Prince does not call for help. He does not wait for dark. He walks out of his position in broad daylight, in the open, in full view of the Germans whose artillery he has been directing fire onto for hours, wearing civilian clothes he has kept folded in his pack for exactly this kind of moment, carrying a hoe he picked up somewhere along the way. And then, in front of an enemy who by every rule of war has every reason to shoot him on sight, he begins to weed a field. He is not weeding a field. He is walking the exact line of the broken telephone wire, one slow, aimless-looking step at a time, and every few yards he crouches down as if to clear a weed, and works the wire back together with his hands. Twice he stops entirely, kneels in the dirt, and appears to tie his shoelaces, while his fingers do the actual work of splicing copper. It takes him the better part of an hour to cover 1,500 yards this way, in the open, under the eyes of men who have been shelled all day and would have every reason to put a bullet in the first stranger who wandered into their sightline. Nobody fires. He finishes the repair, walks back to his own lines, picks up the phone, and calls in the artillery coordinates that let his unit destroy 4 more German positions before nightfall. Nobody explained, at the time, why the Germans hadn't fired on him. It would take historians decades to piece together the full answer, and the answer is not really about that one road in Italy at all. It is about who Tommy Prince was before he ever put on a Canadian uniform, and about a country that, on the same day it was preparing to recommend him for one of its highest military honors, would not have allowed him to vote in its elections. If this is the kind of story you want more of, take a second to hit subscribe, because there are men and women whose names most people have never heard, and their stories are the entire reason this channel exists. To understand what happened on that road, you have to go back nearly 30 years, to a canvas tent in Petersfield, Manitoba, in October of 1915, where Tommy Prince was born, one of 11 children of Harry and Elizabeth Prince, members of the Broken Head Ojibwe Nation, and descendants of the chiefs of the Peguis First Nation. Prince grew up hunting and trapping on the land around Lake Winnipeg, learning to move through bush and swamp without being seen or heard, skills that had nothing to do with any army and everything to do with feeding a family. He also grew up as a citizen of a country that did not, in any meaningful legal sense, consider him a citizen at all. Under Canada's Indian Act, status Indians like Prince could not vote in federal elections, could not leave reserve land without a permit from a government agent, and were governed not by the ordinary laws of the country, but by a separate and lesser bureaucratic regime designed, in the government's own language, to eventually make Indigenous people disappear into the general population, whether they wanted to or not. The Indian Act called this process enfranchisement, and it was framed, on paper, almost like an opportunity. An Indigenous man could, in theory, give up his legal status as an Indian in exchange for full Canadian citizenship, including the right to vote. In practice, it meant he had to give up his legal connection to his own community, his land, and often his family's standing on the reserve, in order to be treated as a full person under the law. It was not a bridge between two ways of belonging. It was a one-way door, and it made the loss of Indigenous identity the official price of Canadian citizenship. Tommy Prince would spend a great deal of his adult life refusing to walk through that door on those terms, while proving, over and over, in uniform, exactly the kind of citizen the country claimed it wanted. Tommy Prince enlisted in the Canadian Army on June 3, 1940, joining the Royal Canadian Engineers, and by 1942, he had volunteered for one of the most dangerous postings available, the newly formed 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. Later that year, he was selected for something stranger and more secretive still, a joint American-Canadian commando unit being assembled at Fort William Henry Harrison, Montana, under a level of operational secrecy usually reserved for entire invasions, not single regiments. This unit would become the 1st Special Service Force, and the Germans would eventually give it a nickname of their own, the Devil's Brigade. The force was built around an idea that most conventional armies of 1942 considered close to insane. Instead of training soldiers to fight the way armies had always fought, in formation, with clear lines and clear rules of engagement, it trained them to disappear. Soldiers of the 1st Special Service Force learned mountaineering, demolitions, hand-to-hand combat, and above all, silence, how to move across terrain that regular infantry considered impassable, at night, without being detected, and to strike and vanish before the enemy fully understood they had been attacked at all. It was, in other words, built around exactly the skills a boy from Brokenhead had been developing since childhood, not in a classroom, but on a trapline. Before any of these men fired a shot at Anzio, they gave themselves away in a much smaller fashion. They blacked their faces with boot polish before every night raid, so that nothing pale would catch the moonlight while they moved. It worked well enough that when Allied forces later recovered the diary of a German lieutenant killed at Anzio, it contained a line that would end up outliving the war itself. He had written that the Black Devils were all around his position every time his unit came into the line, and that his men never heard them come. Nobody in the force ever confirmed that diary was genuine, and it did not need to be, because by then, the nickname had already done its work. An entire elite unit, feared under a single collective name, the Devil's Brigade, the Black Devils, built out of exactly the kind of quiet, patient bushcraft that Canada had spent generations telling men like Tommy Prince was worth nothing outside of a reserve. Tommy Prince did not simply meet the standard the force required. He exceeded it in ways that became legend inside the unit almost immediately. During the brutal, grinding Italian campaign, in the mountains south of Rome, Prince developed a habit that his fellow soldiers noticed and never forgot. Before any mission that required him to move close to German lines undetected, he would change out of his standard-issue combat boots and into a pair of soft moccasins he carried folded in his pack for exactly this purpose. Boots on rock and gravel announce a man's position from 30 yards away. Moccasins do not. Night after night, Prince used that half-inch of silence to walk directly into positions the German army considered secure. He did not always kill the men he found there. Sometimes he did what his mission required and used a knife in the dark and was gone before dawn. But often, deliberately, he did something stranger. He entered a sleeping German position, took nothing that mattered, a single boot, a canteen, a helmet, and left without a sound, without a trace of how he had gotten in or out. German soldiers would wake to find one boot missing from a pair they had taken off 10 feet from their own sentries. They began to talk about it. They gave the man responsible a name, Geist, ghost. The Germans were not being poetic. They meant it literally, and it terrified them in a specific, operational way that ordinary casualties did not. An enemy soldier killed by a bullet is a soldier your side understands. You know the weapon, you know the range, you know, in some rough sense, how to defend against it next time. An enemy who walks past your sentries, stands over you while you sleep, and leaves having proven he could have killed you and chose not to, is something your training has no answer for. It does not matter how many men you post on watch if the thing you are watching for does not need to be seen. During the assault on Monte Macho, Prince moved ahead of his company, located and eliminated the German gun crews defending the summit, and did it so completely and so quietly that the men following behind him climbed to the top of the mountain without firing a single shot of their own. Ask yourself what a German commander was supposed to write in his after-action report. There is no box on the form for, "The enemy did not need weapons." There is no box for, "Our men are afraid of the dark now," specifically. The machinery of a conventional army is built to count and counter conventional threats. How many tanks? How many guns? How many men? It has no mechanism at all for a threat that leaves almost nothing behind for the report to measure, and that is precisely why it worked. The same country that had spent decades trying to erase Tommy Prince's people from its official reckoning of who counted as a full citizen had, without meaning to, produced a soldier the German army could not count, could not predict, and could not stop. Other soldiers in the force noticed something else about him too. He did not seem to need the map the way they did. Men who had grown up reading terrain off a printed sheet found themselves, at night, in country with no landmarks and no visibility, simply following Tommy Prince, because he read the actual ground, the slope of it, the sound of water somewhere below it, the way his own hands and feet had been trained to read it since he was a boy checking trap lines in the Manitoba bush. Nobody had taught him that at Fort Harrison. He had brought it with him, and the United States Army and the Canadian Army had spent a combined 2 decades acting as though it was worth nothing at all. By the summer of 1944, the 1st Special Service Force had moved into southern France, and Prince was given a reconnaissance assignment that would earn him the 2nd of his 2 highest decorations. Tasked with locating a German encampment believed to be operating deep in rugged, unmapped terrain, Prince set out alone, without resupply, and spent the next 72 hours moving through that country on foot, without food, without water, navigating entirely by his own judgment of the land. 3 days is long enough for thirst alone to start affecting a man's judgment, long enough that a soldier moving through hostile, unfamiliar ground on nothing but instinct has every reason to turn back and every excuse ready if he does. Prince did not turn back. He found the camp. He returned to Allied lines, exhausted, and immediately led his unit back to the position he had located. The resulting operation captured more than 1,000 German soldiers, a number roughly equivalent to an entire enemy regiment taken off the field because one man refused to stop walking. For the wire repair outside Litoria, Prince was awarded the Military Medal. For the 72-hour reconnaissance in southern France, the United States awarded him the Silver Star. When the fighting in that region was over, Tommy Prince was summoned not to a base ceremony, but to Buckingham Palace itself, where King George VI personally decorated him, presenting the Military Medal for the British Crown and the Silver Star on behalf of the President of the United States. He became one of only 3 Canadians in the entire war to hold both decorations at once. A man born in a canvas tent, whose own government would not let him cast a ballot, stood in a royal palace, while a king pinned medals to his chest for services that 2 allied nations agreed that were extraordinary. Nobody in that room needed to ask whether Tommy Prince belonged. The Canadian government he went home to would spend the next 30 years acting as though the question was still open. Tommy Prince came home from the war to discover that none of it had changed anything. As a status Indian under the Indian Act, he still could not vote in federal elections, a right that would not be extended to Indigenous Canadians without conditions until 1960. On paper, Indigenous veterans were entitled to the same support as any other soldier returning from the war, including land grants and loans under the Veterans Land Act. In practice, those benefits for status Indians were administered not through the ordinary veterans system, but through the Department of Indian Affairs, the same department that controlled reserve land and required a government permit to leave it, and the department was under no obligation to process a claim quickly, generously, or at all. Many Indigenous veterans across the country came home to find the paperwork simply stalled, indefinitely, in an office that answered to no one they could vote for. Prince tried to build a business. It failed, partly for lack of the capital and support his non-Indigenous comrades received without asking. He became, out of necessity as much as conviction, an advocate. He traveled to Ottawa to lobby the federal government directly, arguing for the abolition of the Indian Act and for full citizenship rights for Indigenous veterans who had, by any measure, already proven what they were willing to sacrifice for a country that would not fully claim them in return. The government listened politely and changed almost nothing. By the early 1950s, facing unemployment and the ordinary, grinding discrimination that had never actually stopped, Tommy Prince did something that still stops people short when they hear it. He re-enlisted. He returned to the Canadian military, resumed training recruits, and became part of the 1st Canadian unit deployed to Korea, serving in combat once again with Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. A man who had already given the war everything it could reasonably ask of anyone went back a second time, in large part because the peace he had fought for had never actually included a place for him in it. Tommy Prince died on November 25, 1977, in Winnipeg. He was homeless at the time of his death. 11 medals, a personal decoration from a king, and a place in the official record as one of the most effective soldiers to serve in either World War, and the country he had done all of it for had allowed him to end his life without a home. It is the kind of detail that does not need editorializing. It simply needs to be said out loud. And yet his funeral was not a quiet one. More than 500 people attended. Members of Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry served as his pallbearers. Manitoba's lieutenant governor was there. Consuls representing the United States, France, and Italy stood among the mourners, sent by governments that had never forgotten what he had done in their countries, even when his own government had spent 30 years finding new ways to forget. His own First Nation buried him with the full honor a warrior is owed by his people, which is, in the end, the honor that mattered most and had never once been in question. Canada, for its part, took considerably longer. In 1991, more than a decade after his death, a street in Winnipeg was finally named for him. It would take until 2019, 75 years after a king had pinned 2 nations' medals to his chest, for the federal government to formally designate Thomas George Prince a National Historic Person, an official acknowledgement, in writing, of exactly what his own country had spent his lifetime declining to fully acknowledge. And, in 2022, Canada Post issued a postage stamp bearing his face, in his Korean War uniform, with the northern lights over the broken-head Ojibwe nation glowing in the sky behind him, 45 years after he died, with nowhere to sleep. None of it was for him. He was long past needing any of it by then. It was for every Canadian who licked that stamp without knowing his name, a small, overdue correction to a country's memory, arriving so late that the only person who could have told you what it was worth was no longer alive to be asked. There is a version of this story that ends with the wire repair, the medals, the palace ceremony, a clean arc of heroism rewarded. That is not this story, and it was never going to be, because the point was never that Tommy Prince proved himself worthy of Canada. He had nothing left to prove to anyone by the time he was crawling along a road in Italy, pretending to tie his shoes while German gunners watched him do it. The point is what it cost him to be treated, for 30 more years, as though the proof was still required, and to have to offer it again anyway, in Ottawa, in job applications, in a second war fought in Korea, simply to be treated as what he had already, unambiguously, become. The Germans who fought him understood something about Tommy Prince almost immediately, that the skills a colonial government had never valued, the quiet, the patience, the total command of terrain other men considered impassable, were exactly the skills that made him the most dangerous man on that mountain. It took his own country another 3 decades, and his death, to even begin to catch up, and even then it arrived as a street sign, a historic designation, a stamp, small paper gestures toward a debt that was never really about paper in the first place. The war asked Tommy Prince to be invisible, and rewarded him for it. His own country asked him to be invisible too, for free, for most of his life, and never once called it a medal. Thank you for watching. If a story like this deserves to be remembered, hit like. It's the simplest way to help it reach the people who need to hear it. Subscribe if you want more of these forgotten stories, the ones that don't make it into the textbooks but should. I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you had family, from any country, on any side, who served, tell me about them in the comments. Those stories deserve to be heard too. Thank you. I'll see you in the next one.